not to attend, and saying it was anti-Semitic and that it was divisive and it was against peace and against freedom of speech. And my question was, if that's against freedom of speech, condemning it and asking people not to come and support, what is that? So I'm glad that you're here, because truth is truth. And I'd like everybody to remember that today is International Women's Day. And I'd like to take a few minutes of silence for the between 800 and 3,000 murdered and missing Indigenous women in Canada, and also for our Palestinian sisters who are going through equally as much hardship as we are as Indigenous women in this country. So I'd like everybody to stand for a minute or two to remember our fallen sisters. Thank you. And before we begin with our speaker, I think it's important that we understand the connections between what's happening in Palestine and what's happening here and what has happened here. I was recently watching a video that you can't find on YouTube. It was taken down very quickly by an ex-Israeli soldier talking about what happened there. And at the end he said, I owe a debt. I owe a debt to the Palestinians for everything that I have here. My home, the land that I live on, all the resources that I enjoy, and I need to repay that debt. And it really hit me. Because all of you are on Treaty 4 territory, and you owe a debt to those in Treaty 4. And debt does not mean guilt. Please do not own guilt. Anybody's guilt does me no good, and it does them no good. If you're part of the solution, which you are because you're here, then don't own that guilt. If you're going to go out there and be a racist, please feel guilty, but they don't. But yes, you owe a debt, just like the Israelis owe a debt, and we must always be cognizant of that. And in owing that debt, the best way to pay it back is to stand up and to right those wrongs and to spread the word. And that's what we need to do, because it's the same colonizers and it's the same mentality. After all, apartheid came from Canada. It started out here with all the policies on my peoples, and it went to Africa, it went apparently from Israel to Palestine, and wherever apartheid is. It's a little known fact, but it came from Canada, and its policies on Indigenous peoples and on First Nations. And so we have to remember that, and if we're going to stand up against it, then we need to stand up against it at home and abroad, because apartheid still exists here in Canada. The UN rapporteur comes through Canada every now and then and listens and says, oh, there's apartheid in Canada, and wraps Canada's knuckles and goes home, and not much changes. So all of us together, standing as true sisters and brothers, no matter what color we are, no matter what walk of life we are, we can and will make a difference Last night Angela Davis talked, and she talked about global mobilizations. And that's what we need to do. That's where our strength is. And that's where we know we can do something. And I don't want to take much more time, so I'm really happy you're here. And I'm going to have Valerie introduce our most honored speaker that we are so fortunate to have here tonight. And thank you once more for being here. And remember, resist.
Before I introduce Ali Abunimah, I just wanted to say a few words about Israeli Apartheid Week. This is the first Israeli Apartheid Week here in Regina. It's an international series of events that began 7 years ago as a project of a handful of activists with the Arab Student Collective in Toronto. And since then has expanded to more than 70 cities across the globe, from Jerusalem to Johannesburg, Dublin, London, New York, Mexico City, and also Sudbury, Ontario, Hamilton, Winnipeg, Calgary, Alberta, if you can believe it, and now here in Regina on Treaty 4 territory. So we're really excited to have everyone here tonight. Israeli Apartheid Week has played a really central role in reclaiming the terms and the language with which we discuss Israel-Palestine, given that this conflict has for so long, like the terms of the discourse have for so long been dictated entirely by Israel and its supporters. And I think for the first time now, we're seeing that this conflict is actually, it's not a conflict, it's an occupation, it's colonization, it's apartheid, and it's resistance to all of those forces. And the solution to this conflict is not about a Palestinian state in a series of discontiguous and isolated ghettos that are surrounded by concrete walls and razor wire. It's about the right of return of more than 5 million Palestinian refugees who've been in refugee camps for more than 6 decades now and are scattered around the world, including here in this room tonight. And it's about an end to the occupation and colonization of all Arab lands, not just the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And it's about full and equal rights to all Palestinian citizens of Israel who live under systematic racism and oppression as a result of their nationality and race and ethnicity. And these are the core demands of the Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions campaign, which began in 2005 and has been an inspiration to Israeli Apartheid Week and also played a central role in the international solidarity movement for the past 5 years and has made 6 years now and has made, I think, really tremendous strides in that time. And I think that now for the first time we're really seeing Israel and its supporters on the defensive as they're continuing to lose ground in this public relations war and resorting to, I think, increasingly desperate and repressive tactics such as canceling room bookings for events such as this one at the last minute on public institutions and universities, banning posters, public smear campaigns, banning even the term Israeli apartheid itself. And I think that, of course, most recently, Michael Ignatio's comments, but I think really we should be heartened by these developments and take it as a sign that this movement is really gaining momentum and it's not going anywhere, and it's increasingly a force to be reckoned with across North America and internationally. And I think if I were a Victor Lieberman, Israel's foreign minister, and heard that Israeli Apartheid Week had now extended to the lesser-known town of Regina, Saskatchewan, I would be quaking in my boots and take that as a sign that Zionism and Israeli apartheid's days are numbered.
And Stephen Harper, too.
And Stephen Harper, absolutely. So I hope that this is the first of many Israeli Apartheid Weeks to come in Israel, in Regina, but not too many, because I think that if there's one thing that's been made resoundingly clear from the events in the Arab world over the last few months, it's that what was previously unthinkable is very much possible, and I don't think there's any reason to believe that if we do our part here as international solidarity activists alongside and in support of the liberation movement in Palestine, there's no reason to believe that we can't see the situation on the ground in Palestine be transformed fundamentally in much the same way as we've seen in the streets of Cairo and Tunis and elsewhere over the past few weeks and months. And I'm delighted to have Ali Abunimah here tonight as our keynote speaker. He's joining us from Chicago, where he's a writer and frequent commentator on Middle East and Arab affairs, as well as a full-time researcher in social policy at the University of Chicago. His writings have appeared in the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, the Chicago Tribune, the Financial Times, Lebanon's Daily Star, Haaretz, and elsewhere. He's the author of One Country, a bold proposal to end the Israel-Palestine impasse. class, which we have for sale here tonight. I encourage you to check out. And he's also one of the co-founders of the Electronic Intifada, which began in 2001 and has been one of the leading sources of independent reporting, analysis, and commentary on Israel and Palestine, and I think a much needed resource amid a sea of disinformation. Ali Abunimah has been a leading voice for Palestinian justice and human rights for many years, and it's my honor to welcome him here tonight.
Good evening. I'm going to do two things. One is put my phone in airplane mode so it doesn't ring. Right? You know, with the iPhone you have so many apps you can never find anything. Okay. The other thing is to put the stopwatch on so I don't talk for too long. And there we go. So, good evening. I'm so delighted to be in Regina. This is my first time here. I had an absolutely beautiful view of the Regina Mountains as the plane approached. The snow-capped peaks, very nice. I'm very grateful to Valerie for her introduction, and to her and to all who have worked to put this event together. I know it's a lot of work when people have busy lives, and they undertake that work because they're committed to it, and that's very important to recognize. And also to thank them for all the other events they've organized during Israeli Apartheid Week, the first one in Regina. And I hope that you will come back for the other events. I heard that Huwaida Araf is coming later in the week. She's a fantastic speaker who was on the last Freedom Flotilla to Gaza, which was attacked by the Israelis. Remy Kenazi, a brilliant poet and passionate activist, is going to be here as well. So please come and support them. And bring your friends and family. So you missed the first event, but you're not going to miss the next ones too. And I would like to thank Sue for her very moving comments, and also to offer my solidarity, congratulation, and love to all of our sisters on International Women's Day, and to share the recognition of the debt that we owe to the indigenous people of what is now called Canada, and to recognize very much that these struggles are linked, that the policies and the practices that we're going to talk about tonight have a common root in colonialism, in a colonialism that went out from Europe to the world and carried on the same practices everywhere. I've seen it in Australia, I've seen it in Canada, I've seen it in the United States, and we see it still in Palestine. If Palestine is distinguished by anything, it's really only that it is an anachronism, that the kind of raw colonialism that was much more common in the 19th century in Canada or the United States or other parts of the world is practiced today openly in the 21st century. Now it's a little bit more subtle in Canada. You don't have the same kind of this brutal settler colonialism that exists in Palestine. But you did have it. Certainly did happen. I also, if I may, I want to really give some comments on the statement of Michael Ignatieff, the leader of the opposition. I think the statement that he posted yesterday on his website about Israeli Apartheid Week is really so outrageous that it cannot pass without comment. I don't know if I'm breaking any Canadian laws by attacking your politicians. I just remember, didn't Michael Moore once fall afoul of the law by speaking about Canadian politicians during an election, and that stayed in my mind. So, he says the following: Israeli Apartheid Week is an attack on the mutual respect that holds our society together. It is a dangerous cocktail of ignorance and intolerance, both of which stand in the way of peace. The Liberal Party of Canada condemns Israeli Apartheid Week in no uncertain terms. Then there's some boilerplate about Middle East peace. You always have to say how committed you are to Middle East peace. And then he says Israeli Apartheid Week does the opposite by portraying the Jewish state as criminal, by demonizing Israel and its supporters, and by targeting Jewish and Israeli students for abuse on our university campuses. The organizers and supporters of Israeli Apartheid Week tarnish our freedom of speech. The voices of anti-Semitism and intolerance have no place in Canada, in the Middle East, or anywhere in the world. All Canadians and all university students have the right to feel safe and secure in our communities, regardless of who they are or what they believe. On behalf of the Liberal Party of Canada and our parliamentary caucus, I urge all Canadians to join with us in once again condemning Israeli Apartheid Week here in Canada and around the world. He should have said, on behalf of the Liberal Party of Canada and our parliamentary caucus, I urge all Canadians to join with us in once again condemning Israeli apartheid here in Canada and around the world. It would have been a laudable statement. But seriously, the claim that the supporters of Israel, that the organizers of Israeli Apartheid Week are anti-Semitic, are anti-freedom, or are targeting Jewish and Israeli students for abuse on campuses is, in my view, probably libelous. And I hope that those who have been targeted by this scurrilous and scandalous accusation by Michael Ignatieff will pursue the question of whether or not these accusations are libelous. Of course, one Canadian who visited the occupied West Bank wrote about it in The Guardian of London on April 19th, 2002. He wrote about it in a helicopter, and he wrote the following: When I look down at the West Bank, at the settlements like Crusader forts occupying the high ground, at the Israeli security cordon along the Jordan River, closing off the Palestinian lands from Jordan, I knew I was not looking down at a state or the beginnings of one, but at a Bantustan, one of those pseudo-states created in the dying years of apartheid to keep the African population under control. Of course, those words were written by none other than Michael Ignatieff. So he's a hypocrite as well. And just so people don't think there's any party political goal here, if you bring me other statements from any other party leaders, I'd be happy to give them the same treatment. Of course, there is practices of apartheid, that Israel is built on an ideology that is akin to apartheid in so many ways. One of the notable facts about Israel's history is its close relationship with apartheid South Africa throughout the years in which the rest of the world was boycotting and isolating apartheid South Africa. A brilliant book came out on this just last year, The Unspoken Alliance, by I can't say the name of the author because I forget it. I mean, it's one of those names that doesn't stick. but it's a brilliant book, The Unspoken Alliance, which is a very detailed history of the close relationship, ideological affiliation, military cooperation, that most of the weapons that were used to crush the township uprisings in apartheid South Africa were made in Kibbutz Beit Alpha in what is now called Northern Israel. And of course, the kibbutzes were marketed to the world as these wonderful socialist communes, while Kibbutz Beit Alpha was exporting riot control gear and other weaponry to apartheid South Africa to crush the anti-apartheid struggle. Of course, at a time when most of the world had called for an arms embargo on South Africa, the Israelis outfitted almost completely the South African Air Force and Navy. The Israelis provided the South Africans with warplanes, which were used in over-occupied Namibia, what was then occupied by South Africa, and the Navy. When I was in South Africa last year, one of the former government ministers in the ANC government and one of the veterans of the anti-apartheid struggle, Ronnie Casriels, mentioned a story where he said that after 1994 he became deputy defense minister. And he said one of the things they learned was how shoddy the equipment was the Israelis had sold South Africa, and how poorly the Israeli supplied warplanes had performed against the Soviet MiGs in Angola. But this is, the point here is this is quite uncontroversial. That history is well documented. Of course, Israel's role in nuclear proliferation. It's now believed, there's pretty good evidence that South Africa and Israel work closely on developing nuclear weapons. South Africa, of course, abandoned its nuclear weapons in 1994. Israel still maintains its nuclear weapons. One last point about the historic relationship, by the way. Those Bantustans, which Michael Ignatieff wrote about in his intolerant and anti-Semitic article in The Guardian in 2002, were the only country in the world that Bantustan, for those who aren't familiar with the term, was a word used to describe pseudo-states, nominally independent homelands for black South Africans that were created by the apartheid government in the 1970s and 80s as a kind of ruse. The basic demand of the black majority in South Africa was one person, one vote, full citizenship for all the people who live in South Africa, including the descendants of the white colonists and settlers. And the apartheid government's response was, well, okay, you want political rights, that's all very well with us, we'll create states for you. And these black homelands, the Bantustans, were scattered enclaves. People were forced to move to them. They were often on very poor land, very far away from the urban and economic centers of South Africa. And they had puppet governments which were entirely controlled by and subsidized by South Africa with little local dictators. In fact, very much the model of the so-called Palestinian state that is emerging in the West Bank. And what you learn from the history is that the South Africans came to Israel in the 1980s. I wrote about this in my book, which I'm going to plug now because it's very heavy. It's a light read, very heavy in your suitcase, so I'm hoping you won't make me take them away from Regina with me. But one of the things I wrote about in the 1980s, the South Africans coming to Israel to study how Israel managed its problem with the Palestinians. And Meron Ben-Benisti, who was deputy mayor of Jerusalem, recalls a meeting where the South Africans came and said, you know, we've come to learn how you deal with this. The Israelis are shocked. They say, what do you mean? You have a horrible system of apartheid, and we're a wonderful, enlightened state. And the South Africans look at them bewildered and say, what do you mean? We have the same problem, and we've come up with the same solution, and we want to see how you're managing it. And that was a wake-up call for them, but the history is there. The present today is one where you can see the ideology at the root of apartheid. And by the way, apartheid, when you talk about one of the sort of red herring arguments used against saying that Israel is an apartheid state as well. Oh, well, Israel is so different from South Africa. Well, of course it's different from South Africa. No two countries are identical. Israel doesn't have to be identical to apartheid South Africa for the charge of apartheid to stick. Because the crime of apartheid is defined in international law. It's defined by a UN treaty on the crime of apartheid. And the crime of apartheid, if you look it up, you Google it, you'll find it is defined as a system that is designed to provide racial privilege for one group of people over another. A system, systematic policies and practices. And this is what you see, infused in every aspect of Israeli law, policy, and practice, and even to an increasing degree popular culture, is a denigration of Palestinians, a denial of their existence. At least in Canada, there is now official acknowledgement that indigenous people were here and were wronged. You have some redress on specific issues. There is recognition of the damage that was done by the wholesale kidnapping of native children and forcing them into residential schools whose goal was to erase and eliminate their culture and their identity and to turn them into sort of mirror images of at the time the colonists imagined a white Christian Canadian should look like. Well, in Palestine after 1948, there was a systematic effort by Israel to erase any trace of Palestinian existence before the State of Israel. Systematic erasure of Palestinian place names. Hundreds of mosques were demolished or destroyed. Some of them still exist and have been turned into nightclubs, for example. There are many cases. Meron Ben-Benisti, who I mentioned earlier, the former deputy mayor of Jerusalem, wrote a brilliant book about this called Sacred Landscape in 2000, in which he talks about the systematic effort to erase any trace of Palestinian existence. Of course, the basic constitution of Israel, and I use constitution with a small c, because Israel has no single written document that is a constitution. It has a series of basic laws and other laws that amount to a constitution, but it doesn't have a Bill of Rights. There's no such thing in Israel as a Charter of Rights. There's no definition of a citizen that says that all citizens have such and such rights, because citizens in Israel don't have those rights. You have different classes of citizenship. Israel is the only state in the world today that is not the state of its citizens. And what do I mean by that? Israel claims to be the state of the Jewish people, wherever they are. So if you go to a website called Nefesh B'Nefesh, this is an Israeli government agency that in the United States raises money tax exempt. It has tax exempt status, and I would not be surprised at all if it has the same status in Canada, which is scandalous, because a charitable purpose can, I think, never include dispossessing people of their land and their rights. But this organization, Nefesh B'Nefesh, tries to recruit Canadians to go and live in the occupied territories and in Israel in the north to settle. Now the condition is they have to be Jewish as defined by the State of Israel, because of course the State of Israel doesn't recognize all people who call themselves Jewish as Jews. Another problem. So a Canadian has more rights in Palestine than a Palestinian. Because meanwhile, while the Israeli government is recruiting and paying Canadians to move to Palestine, Palestinians born there have no right to return, no right to enter the country. In Gaza, you have 1.5 million people who are effectively imprisoned for one crime, is that they're not Jews. 80% are refugees from lands that are now in Israel. The vast majority of those lands are empty. No one is living on them. But they're not allowed to return. I mean, you have a land without a people for a people without a land. It's a good description of the Palestinians in Gaza. Their land is empty, and they are cooped up in this giant prison for one reason, that they're not Jews. If you change one thing about Palestinians in Gaza or in the refugee camps of Lebanon or Jordan or anywhere else, one thing about them, their religion, then they would be not only allowed to return, but they would be subsidized, given homes, given jobs, given training, and so on. We're not talking about Palestinians being people. You say, well, every country has a right to control immigration. We're not talking about immigrants. We're talking about the indigenous people of the country who are subjected to these racist apartheid policies. We're talking about the indigenous people of the country. That is the difference. Israel came, they cleansed the land of its indigenous people, and they said, now we're a Jewish state. Well, you're not Jewish? Sorry, not our problem. Well, that might be fine for them, but it's not an injustice, it's not an outrage that the rest of us are bound to accept. And this is what this struggle is about. It's about recognizing the full equality of all human beings. The moment we're in, I think, is crucial, because Palestinians have asked the world to help them to do it, to help them to end these injustices. In 2005, almost 200 Palestinian civil society organizations, representing the broad spectrum of Palestinian society inside Palestine and in the diaspora, issued what's now known as the Palestinian Civil Society Call for Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions. This was issued in 2005, coming up to 6 years ago. And it calls very simply for a comprehensive global grassroots campaign of boycott, divestment, and sanctions on Israel until Israel meets 3 conditions. Number 1, ending the occupation of all Arab land that began in 1967, ending the occupation and colonization. Number 2, ending all forms of discrimination and inequality, legal and de facto and de jure, against Palestinian citizens of Israel, the 20% of Israeli citizens who are the survivors and descendants of those who managed to remain behind in 1948. And 3, respecting, promoting, and implementing the right of return for Palestinian refugees in accordance with international law. There is nothing racist about these goals. These are goals rooted in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. They say that all people are created equal, all people have a right to live in their own land without being thrown off it because they're the wrong color or the wrong height or the wrong religion or the wrong anything else. Nothing racist about that, nothing anti-Semitic about it, Mr. Ignatieff, and nothing intolerant or anti-freedom. These are supposedly the values which Canada stands for. Those are the values that are contained in the Palestinian civil society call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions. This campaign is modeled on the one that in the 1970s and 80s, those of us who are old enough to remember, participated in proudly when it came to apartheid in South Africa. And it's been endorsed by all of our brothers and sisters in South Africa who are veterans of that struggle, by Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who has been unflinching in his support despite the slander and the libel against him by supporters of apartheid in Israel. It's supported by COSATU, the Confederation of South African Trade Unions, and so many other individuals and organizations who are veterans of the anti-apartheid struggle. I was disappointed when last year Margaret Atwood, who I think after timber and oil shale and natural gas is Canada's largest export. When Margaret Atwood accepted a $1 million prize, the Dan Prize from Tel Aviv University, despite a plea from Palestinian civil society for her not to do so, that doing so would really be a slap in the face to the Palestinians who are struggling for their rights. And nevertheless, she decided to go ahead with that, and I think really didn't defend herself very well. But of course I mention this because Margaret Atwood very proudly supported the boycott, divestment and sanctions movement in solidarity with South Africa. So we must ask our public figures and celebrities and authors and cultural giants to be consistent. That you cannot say we're against apartheid in South Africa, but we're perfectly fine with it as long as it's Palestinians who are suffering. We must ask that they're consistent. The tactic of boycott, divestment, and sanctions is perfectly legitimate. It is, in my view, I think of it as a technology. It's not an end in itself. We boycott, we divest, we impose sanctions in order to bring about an outcome. That outcome is to see human rights implemented, to see people's rights restored, to see all the people who live in the country have a possibility of a decent, dignified life of equality. That's the goal. BDS is simply a tactic, a technology. It doesn't target Israelis as individuals, as some of the counterclaims try to sort of scare people. It targets a system, and there are clear principles which you can find if you go to the BDS movement website, for example. It doesn't target Jews. One of the real slanders is to say that this is a boycott of Jews. This is totally wrong, and anyone who calls for a boycott of people because they're Jews is absolutely not a part of this movement and is totally on the wrong track. And in fact, many Jews in Canada and the United States and indeed in Palestine and Israel are part of this movement. You have groups like Boycott from Within, which is an Israeli group that advocates for international boycott in support of Palestinian rights. So anyone can join this movement. All you have to do is believe that in the stated goals, which are completely consistent with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Let's compare some of the tactics of the BDS movement and Israel, which objects to BDS. Academic boycott. A lot of people are very uncomfortable with academic boycott. What does this mean? Does it mean boycotting individual Israeli students or professors? Absolutely not. We shouldn't do that. We should not shun people because they're from Israel. What it means is boycotting connections and programs between our universities and Israeli universities. Because Israeli universities are complicit in so many of the human rights abuses. The deep connection between Israeli universities and the military, for example. The fact that universities like Tel Aviv University are built on the ruins of Palestinian villages that were plans, and there is not even any acknowledgement of that. You go to Tel Aviv University, you don't see any marker that says this used to be the village of Sheikh Mohannis, whose residents are now in refugee camps in Lebanon or Gaza or Jordan or wherever they may be. The universities are complicit in this, and that's quite well documented. When we talk about academic freedom, shouldn't that be for everyone? Shouldn't it be for Palestinian university professors and students in Gaza who, living in a prison, are unable to travel for research, whose universities cannot form connections with the University of Regina or Toronto or York or wherever it is, who can't benefit from being able to be part of the world of research because they're living under siege. Shouldn't we ask Israel to end its boycott of Palestinian schools and universities? While supporters of BDS called for a boycott of Israeli universities, 2 days ago, Israeli F-16s bombed the Islamic University in Gaza, flattening a number of its buildings. This was not widely reported in the news. We did not hear any calls for a no-fly zone over Gaza or the West Bank. Nobody's calling for Israeli universities to be bombed with F-16s. During Israel's attack on Gaza in winter 2008-2009, of the 640 schools, primary and secondary schools in the Gaza Strip, of 640 schools, 18 were completely destroyed by Israeli bombing, 8 of them kindergartens, and more than 240 were damaged. So half the schools in Gaza were damaged or destroyed by Israeli bombing. How about that for academic boycott? And almost none of these schools have been rebuilt because Israel still forbids cement and steel and iron and other building supplies from coming into the Gaza Strip. So before we talk about, so anybody who says to you, look, we support academic freedom, say, what about academic freedom for Palestinians? Now, piece of news that came up yesterday in Haaretz. Bill to punish anti-Israel boycotters passes first Knesset hurdle. So, and you can see this movement has become such a threat to Israel that they're trying to outlaw it. The Knesset, of course, being the Israeli parliament, on Monday approved in its first reading a boycott law which would levy harsh punitive fines on Israelis who call for academic or economic boycotts against Israeli institutions. The draft law also calls for imposing sanctions against foreign nationals and organizations that call for anti-Israel boycotts, as well as against states that pass legislation giving such boycotts force of law. This is quoting one of the legislators. This is an important and reasonable bill that will enable us to continue to ask the U.S. to take legal action against citizens who boycott Israel. So the target is not just Israelis, but to reach to the United States and presumably Canada as well to stop us from talking about this. Foreign citizens who violate the law could be prohibited from entering Israel for 10 years or more. Now, so what does this add up to? The Israeli response to boycott, divestment, and sanctions is boycott, divestment, and sanctions. I can't think of a clearer endorsement of the tactic than that. The difference is, when we support boycott, divestment, and sanctions, it is in order to end a system of racial discrimination and apartheid, whereas they want to use it to preserve a system of racial discrimination and apartheid. The ends matter, even if the tactics sound the same. I think, and I'd like to echo Valerie's comments in her introduction, that there's no reason to believe this can't be done. We are used to thinking of justice in Palestine, of freedom for the Palestinians, as something that is distant, that's far away. And I think we have to change the way we think about it. We have to start thinking about something that is within our reach within the next few years. And we have to step up our mobilization and our engagement with that in mind. Everything points to this being possible. Not inevitable, but within our reach. For many years now, I've seen a trend that, again, I write about, where Israel is at an ideological dead end. There's nowhere else to go. Israel operates a de facto, my book talks about a one-state solution. When it came out a few years ago, people said that's crazy. Just the other day, Netanyahu was publicly speaking about a one-state solution and the danger of a one-state solution. But we have to recognize that Israel already has the de facto policy of successive Israeli governments is a one-state solution from the river to the sea. How can we interpret it any other way? Since the so-called peace process began almost 20 years ago, Israel has continued to confiscate Palestinian land, build settlements, almost tripling, more than doubling, almost tripling the number of settlers in the West Bank and around Jerusalem in the past 20 years, and doing everything possible to prevent the emergence of a Palestinian state, the emergence of a two-state solution. Even now, when we have more and more countries recognizing a Palestinian state, I don't believe in these gimmicks. I think that this is a gimmick that is a substitute. Some countries may do it sincerely, but I think when the UK or the United States raise the status of the Palestinian diplomatic mission in their capitals, it's a cynical gesture. It's like recognizing the Bantustans. But my point is that even these empty gestures of recognizing a non-existent Palestinian state, Israel objects to. So where is this two-state solution? It's not there. Israel has a de facto one-state solution. But it's an apartheid state. And it's not an apartheid state that is content with the status quo. It is an apartheid state that continues to push the Palestinians out of Jerusalem, out of the Nakab, the Negev, trying to take over the Galilee. It's a one-state solution that doesn't rest, that continues to impose laws that would be considered horrifying in any other democracy. Loyalty oaths. You have something called the I think it's called the Admissions Committee Bill, which is a law that allows communities in Israel to decide who can live in them. It's clearly understood in Israel that this is a means to to allow Jewish towns from it's a means to allow Jewish towns to prevent Arabs, Palestinian citizens of Israel, from moving into them. And this is becoming a big problem for Jewish towns because since 1948, Israel has prohibited the construction of a single new town for its Arab population. You have to think about this. In 1948, 90% of Palestinians were ethnically cleansed from the area that became Israel. About 150,000 Palestinians were left. Today their numbers have grown to about almost 1.5 million. This is just within the pre-1967 borders of Israel. It would be good to have a map. I'm sorry I didn't think of putting one up. But the point is that you have, just dealing with the Palestinians inside Israel who have Israeli citizenship, their numbers have grown about tenfold since Israel was founded, and the number of new towns and developments Israel has allowed them to build is zero. Zero. So there's a need to move into places where housing is available. And as Palestinians move to places where there's housing, which is predominantly Jewish towns, we see this reaction of laws passed to prevent this from happening. In Canada, in the United States, you have equal housing laws. In Israel, they're passing unequal housing laws. In 2011, you have recently, a few months ago, in December, 300 rabbis, municipal rabbis, whose salaries are paid by the State of Israel, issued a decree banning Jews from renting or selling property to Arabs. These are not crackpot rabbis in the West Bank. They are 300 municipal rabbis whose salaries are paid by the state. Yesterday, another news item. Rabbi Israel Rosen called for a boycott. So boycott is okay sometimes. I hereby call for a boycott of I'll just read the introduction. Rabbi Israel Rosen, head of the Somet Institute, dedicated to merging halachic Judaism with modern life, has launched a scathing attack on a Knesset member of the Independence faction over her marriage to a non-Jewish man. He made the statement following reports that Wilf, her name is Einat Wilf, would be appointed chairwoman of the Knesset's Education Committee. I hereby call for a boycott of all of her public activities in these fields, as a clear negative character, being married to a German who is not Jewish, and I believe hasn't acquired citizenship either, the rabbi wrote in an article published in a Shabbat leaflet. The 300 municipal rabbis had also called for a boycott of any Jew who does business or rents or sells to an Arab. This is in 2011. So I think that when Israel has reached this point of a de facto one-state solution with increasing racism, racists
gone wild, there is nowhere to go. As Valerie mentioned, the only tools that are at Israel's disposal to try to maintain this setup is increasing repression. And that manifests in a number of ways. Massacres, as we saw in Gaza in 2008, which was not about rockets. If someone wants to ask me about that in the Q&A in a few minutes, we can talk about that. The real reason was to try to eliminate any remains of resistance in Gaza. Through repression of Palestinian citizens, through the regular tear gassing and beating and shooting of Palestinians and solidarity activists, including Israelis, who protest against Israel's land confiscations in the West Bank, and through the attempt to silence debate, discussion, and action in North America and other countries. I think that Israel is very vulnerable now because of this. The BBC World Service published a poll a few days ago. I had to dig to find, I was immediately, I think it was South Africa, Brazil, and Germany. It's not Canada. I blame Margaret Atwood, Stephen Harper, and Michael Ignatieff. But they didn't mention who was at the bottom of the poll, and that immediately got me suspicious. I thought, oh, Israel's got to be at the bottom because they didn't mention it. BBC is scared to death now of mentioning Israel negatively, even if it's the truth. So when I went and dug out the report, something stunning. It says, Israel remains one of the world's most negatively viewed countries, alongside Iran, North Korea, and Pakistan. This was just published yesterday. According to the latest annual survey of global opinion by the BBC World Service. But most significantly, well, that introduction I wrote, but based on the BBC report. But most significantly, according to the full results of the survey, and I quote, while overall views of Israel have not moved substantially over the past year, there have been significant increases in negative views of the country among Americans, rising from 31 to 41%, and Britons from 50% to 66%. This is stunning, and it's a crisis for Israel. And look what's happening. You have just the other day, a veteran Israeli diplomat, Ilan Baruch, quits and says he can no longer represent the government. I quote from him. He wrote a letter to all foreign ministry employees when he quit to explain his motives. He said, identifying the objection expressed by global public opinion to the occupation policy as anti-Semitic is simplistic, provincial, and artificial. Experience shows that this global trend won't change until we normalize our relations with the Palestinians. In other words, you have an Israeli diplomat resigning and taking a shot at the kind of silly arguments being pushed by Michael Ignatieff. The good people who organized Israeli Apartheid Week all over Canada and all over the world are anti-Semites and intolerant and anti-freedom when they know better, and I think the rest of the world is starting to know better as well. So, what are they left with? They're left with that kind of slander and libel, and they're left with increasingly shrill racial and Islamophobic arguments. And that has been the mainstay of pro-Israel activism over the past decade, particularly since September 11th, 2001. We Israelis are the vanguard of Western civilization and democracy amid, a region of savages and barbarians. Well, who asked you to go there in the first place? But you're there, fine, okay. Now, that has involved, particularly in the United States, and I think this has also happened in Canada, a shift in the base of support for Israel away from a traditional, liberal, somewhat progressive base in the 1960s and 70s towards the increasingly extreme xenophobic, and radical Christianist right wing. And in the United States, you've seen an alliance between the main pro-Israel organizations and the extreme, often anti-Semitic radical Christian right. And it's often anti-immigrant, racist, etc., etc. And that shift, I think, is one that was a fundamental strategic mistake by pro-Israel groups, because the majority are not there. Now, you may see the United States from Canada as being a bunch of crazies. But the reality is that, you know, the extreme right of the United States is big, it's strong, but it's probably about 30% that will consistently vote for these. You know, they can win because they can, you know, mobilize people more than others. But it's not a constituency that you can grow out of. And the Israelis have recognized the contradiction between making that your base and trying to market Israel as a progressive, liberal, Western, you know, lovely democracy. And that's why we see these rather desperate Hasbara propaganda tactics now of trying to sell Israel as, you know, gay-friendly, environment-friendly. All those are fine causes. You know, but I mean, supposing tomorrow Israeli scientists invented a cure for cancer, we'd all be very grateful. We'd all say, that's absolutely fantastic. That's going to benefit all of humanity. But what we wouldn't say is, and so now it's okay for you to be an apartheid state. I mean, imagine, like, wasn't the first heart transplant done by a South African surgeon? This was great. How many lives has his pioneering work saved? But no one said, well, you invented heart transplants, therefore apartheid is okay. So these policies simply will not work. These strategies won't convince people anymore when they see the reality on the ground. So I want to end, coming up to an hour, is that, so the point I wanted to make there is that Zionism and the Israeli state are at an ideological dead end. They can no longer cover up the reality, the racist, apartheid, colonial reality. They have nowhere to go. They offer no vision. Their tactic, delaying tactic of going along with the fake peace process while building and building and building has come to an end. No one buys that anymore. The world is waking up to it, even in North America, as the BBC opinion poll shows. This makes them very vulnerable. Two, a good thing, call for equality, universal human rights, an end to these awful practices. The broader regional context, and I want to end with some comments about this, really give us hope. I spent most of January and half of February in between Qatar and Amman. I was actually supposed to go to Gaza, but my ticket to Cairo was, I think, on the 26th or 27th of January. And if you told me, would you cancel your trip to Gaza, you know, so the Egyptians can have a revolution and get rid of Hosni Mubarak, I'd say, of course, yes. So I wasn't at all bothered by this, but I didn't get to go to Gaza. But this also undermines the racist and culturalist notion that, you know, Arabs are incapable of democracy or don't want it. And it has exposed the reality that these dictatorships were supported by the United States and other Western countries, and that the Obama administration was doing all it could to save Mubarak, or to save the Mubarak regime. At a certain point, they were ready to get rid of Mubarak in order to preserve the regime, and to install the torturer Omar Suleiman as Mubarak's successor. And the Egyptian people foiled that plan. They foiled the American counter-revolution. But what Tunisia and Egypt show us is that the revolution has continued. Tunisia, just yesterday, announced that it was abolishing its state security police, the first Arab country to do so, to get rid of the whole system of political policing and control of the population that has been a standard feature. And most of these mukhabarat, as we call them, these security agencies, have worked closely with the Western security agencies and governments. Egypt is following the same path. Citizens took over the Amn al-Dawla, the headquarters of the state security police in Cairo. And we are seeing real deep transformations taking place. People aren't saying, okay, we overthrew the head and that's it. They are continuing. And these and even if the change doesn't come in the same form in all countries, the pressure is there. Egypt's regional role will change. You know, all the worry was in the United States and other countries was, oh, will Egypt tear up its peace treaty with Israel? I think it probably won't, if I was to guess. But the peace treaty never required Egypt to carry on the way it has. Never required Egypt to be complicit in Israel's crimes, the siege in Gaza, to be the linchpin or the keystone in a sectarian regional alliance against Iran. None of this was in the peace treaty. And we already see Egypt's foreign policy shifting, even though the revolution isn't complete. And taking Egypt out of the American-Israeli camp to play a more independent role and to return to the Arab fold. So you have regional shifts in the balance of power that I think favor justice in the long run. And the transformations show a point that I've tried to make many times over the years, is that, you know, there's a fallacy that we all engage in, that we think that is true for us personally and also true for us collectively or as countries or communities, that because every day that, you know, today is a lot like yesterday. Yesterday is a lot like the day before, and so on. So we think tomorrow is going to be the same as today. But the reality is that, heaven forbid, you could find out you have a terrible illness. You could win the lottery. You could get your dream job. You could meet the love of your life. There's no guarantee that tomorrow is going to be exactly like today. And this is also true for countries. And we've seen this so many times in history, that when change comes, it's not that it was unpredicted. For years and years, people have been speculating about the possibility of Arab peoples rising up against their governments. But nobody could predict the moment. Nobody could predict the spark. Nobody could imagine that Muhammad Bouazizi in the town of Sidi Bouzid would get so fed up that he would set himself on fire and inspire his countrymen to revolt until they had cleansed the old regime. So radical change is possible. We've seen that. And we need to prepare for it. We need to be building. We need to be engaging, mobilizing in boycott, divestment, and sanctions. And we need to be thinking about the future. What kind of Palestine can be a hospitable home for all the people who live in it? I think that is our urgent challenge, and it's one that we can achieve. For me personally, I don't think this is a project that is for 20, 30, or 50 years. I think about the generation of Palestinians who witnessed the Nakba, the ethnic cleansing in 1948, who are still alive today. Most of them are getting quite on in years. They may be our parents or our grandparents, and I think we owe it to them to let them to see this justice in their lifetimes. Thank you.
I just have a couple quick announcements before we get on to the question and answer. First and foremost, I'd like to thank the Regina Public Interest Research Group for helping to make these events possible, in addition to the personal credit cards of some of our members. And to that end, we will be passing along a box for anyone who's able to contribute a donation to some of the significant expenses for this series of events, which have all been free and open to the public. So if anyone can help us out, that would be greatly appreciated, and would also put us in a position to organize similar events in the future. We'll also be passing around a sign-up sheet, so people are interested in hearing about upcoming events or getting involved, then please leave us your contact information. And last but not least, just a reminder to come out to the other events that we have planned this Thursday. We've got an event focused on colonization and apartheid here at home. We'll be screening Ganasitake, which is about the Oka standoff in 1990, and we'll have a panel with Joyce Green and Sue Durange, who is introducing here tonight. And that's at the Luther Auditorium at 6:30 on Thursday. And next week we have Huwaida Araf from the International Solidarity Movement and the Free Gaza Campaign, who will be speaking also at the Luther Auditorium at 7 p.m. And lastly, a closing social event at Mysteria Gallery on Wednesday with Palestinian poet Rami Kanazi, who will be joining us from New York. So please check out our website, reginasolidaritygroup.com, for more details, and I'll pass it back to Ollie for the question and answer. There's a microphone, I think just one, but if people wanted to line up there with questions or comments, then we welcome them all.
Thank you. I noticed that it's a very big box going around, so I'm quite drunk to fill it.
Do your best to fill it. I can kind of see you. I have the bright lights in my face. So whoever wants to step forward can do so. Thank you.
If you could speak to this sort of radicalization of the Israeli society in regards to the military and sort of right-wing, extremely orthodox Jews trying to infiltrate the army and the IDF and their dictating policy in the occupied territory.
Yes. Of course, Israel is unique in many ways, but I tend to view it, I think, most usefully through the lens of settler colonialism. And I think you can learn a lot about Israel by looking at the experience of the settler colonial societies. And here I think the comparisons with South Africa and Northern Ireland are very useful. Without going into great detail, there are similarities in the setup. That this was the ruling group was descended from a settler community. That there was some distinction made in Northern Ireland. It was along the lines of religion between settler and native. In South Africa, of course, it was a racial distinction. And you see that the ruling group develops an ideology of a sort of a mirror ideology to the way people outside that group see them. So you see this very much with Israelis, with Afrikaners, with Unionists and Loyalists in Northern Ireland, that we are the oppressed group, the whole world is against us, that we have a special covenant with God, that our very survival and existence is at stake. Why does the world pick on us? Can't they see, that we're right and everyone else is wrong? And so there are some common features that you see. So I think that on the one hand, the specific features of Israel is you see this growth of messianic religious Zionism, particularly since 1967, which I think was a kind of ideological and religious device to justify colonizing the West Bank after 1967. That's when you see the real rise of that. Well, what's the justification for holding onto the West Bank and East Jerusalem? Well, we've redeemed this holy land. But that actually wasn't very much present in Israeli ideology before 1967.
So, to a certain extent, I see this radicalization as a feature of a settler colonial unit, and I see parallels between what happened with whites in South Africa in the years before the end of apartheid, where you saw increasing radicalization, increasing move to the right. You saw groups like the Africana resistance movement of Eugene Terre Blanche, just gaining tens of thousands of new members. You saw support moving from the National Party to the even more far-right Conservative Party. And so people always said, well, you may talk about a non-racial South Africa with one person, one vote, but this is unrealistic because whites will never accept it. And I think you see similar parallels now in Israel with increasing religiosity, radicalization. People react to it the same way. But I think after the ideological break, after the power shift, a lot of that dissipates. Of course, I don't have a crystal ball, but I think that that's driving a lot of the violence. I mean, the pogroms by the settlers is driven by this ideology. But the settlers themselves are not an independent force. They are dependent on the Israeli state, and the Israeli state is dependent on external support. So once you break the whole system, I think all of that dissipates. I'm giving you this long answer to say is I'm not convinced that the religious radicalism is by itself enough of a factor to sustain the situation on the ground. And therefore it's not insurmountable, which I think is an important point to make. Does that make any sense? Okay.
These days, it seems like there is some pressure from the international community to do something. And for that reason, we heard that Benjamin Netanyahu tried to offer some kind of settlement. How do you see this idea? I mean, his ideas about not permanent.
An interim agreement, long-term
something like that.
Yeah.
You think the international community can buy this again and again and again?
This is a question about the so-called peace process and what role it has played in the past 20 years. And I think it has played for the Israelis the role of buying time. That Israel was always headed for the cliff in terms of being, ideologically at the dead end, or I'm mixing metaphors furiously here, over a cliff and into a dead end. They could see now you have the demographic shift taking place, that Palestinians are once again the numerical majority in historic Palestine from the river to the sea. And they saw all that coming, but they couldn't change course. So their only strategy was to buy time through the peace process. As former Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir said back in the early days of the peace process, after he left office, he said, we would have continued the negotiations for 10 years while, and in the meantime, we would have 500,000 settlers in the West Bank. Well, that's exactly what Israel did. For the so-called international community, I use the term so-called a lot because I think we should always question these terms. International community, when it's used casually in the media, when you analyze it, means the United States and its sidekicks. It doesn't mean the international community. One of its literal sidekicks is Canada, We know you're up here. Even though you don't think we forget about Canada. I love Canada, I really do. I'm just kidding. In fact, all Americans, except for that 30% I talked about earlier, constantly say they want to move to Canada. You know that we know that you wouldn't have us though. But if you think about the role that the peace process has played for these countries, the so-called international community, it has been really a fig leaf.
It's been a way to get off the hook and to evade responsibility. A prime example of that is the Goldstone report. Here you had a UN Commission report by an impeccable group of international officials headed by Judge Richard Goldstone, the former head of the Special Tribunal on Yugoslavia, former judge of the South African Supreme Court, a man who played an important role in the transition after apartheid, a self-described Jew and supporter of Israel, who conducted this report that you can read online, or better still buy the book, because recently an edited version came out in which I have an essay edited by Phil Weiss and Adam Horowitz and Lizzie Ratner, with some fantastic commentaries from other people. But here you have this report that presents clear, transparent evidence of war crimes and crimes against humanity committed in Gaza by Israel, and also looks at Palestinian actions. It's all laid out there. And the United States and the other countries that have opposed any action on the Goldstone report have justified it by saying, well, you know, this would get in the way of the peace process. Well, what peace process? So, using a dead peace process as a way to avoid the responsibility of implementing international law, holding Israel to account. Look at the United States a few weeks ago, vetoed yet another UN Security Council resolution condemning Israeli settlement. And this was a very mild resolution. I was against introducing it, not that I have any weight on the matter, because I feel like it dilutes the previous resolutions if it had passed. It's so weak. But yet the US vetoed it. And the excuse is, well, this would get in the way of the peace process. So it's become this excuse, and also for politicians personally, who want to avoid difficult questions. If you go to them and say, why aren't you doing anything about what's going on? Why aren't you holding Israel accountable? They can say, oh, well, it's very sad, but we really support the peace process because we all love peace and we all want there to be peace. So, under the guise of this peace process, horrors have happened, real horrors, massacres, ethnic cleansing, deportation, anything. The normalization of extrajudicial executions. Israel, back when Israel started openly carrying out extrajudicial executions using helicopters and drones and death squads dressed up as Arabs and all that, the world used to pretend, the international community used to pretend to be horrified. Now they do it themselves in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, in Yemen, where it's become normal. So this is the Israelification also of our own societies. You see this a great deal in Canada with the securitization policies as well. So all of this happened under the guise of the peace process. The problem now is this game has run its course. So this is what surprised Netanyahu, in that, he was very confident and jaunty. We go to Washington and we say, yes, we love peace. And why don't the Palestinians come and negotiate with us? We beg them to come and negotiate. You don't like what we do? Come and negotiate. Nobody buys this anymore. Just the other day there was a report in the Haaretz about Angela Merkel, the German Chancellor, one of the most pro-Israel politicians in Europe, unquestioningly pro-Israel politicians, who basically hung up on the phone on Netanyahu and basically told him in not quite as many words that he's a liar, because he told her, oh, we're going to have this new peace plan. So all this is an effort to play the same old game, and it's come to an end. So nobody is going to buy Netanyahu's talk of a long-term, interim, something, Palestinian state with provisional, I don't know what. This is nonsense. You will hear politicians saying, oh yes, well we should, don't buy it from them and don't let them get away with it. We now have to focus
not on what the men in suits do, but what the men in uniforms are doing on the ground. That has to be the standard by which we judge what is going on. And we also must bring an end to this double standard where, you know, I hope we would all support the Libyan people trying to rid themselves of Colonel Gaddafi and his regime. But, you know, amazing how fast they start saying the ICC, the International Criminal Court, like that, they opened an investigation into Libya. And the Goldstone report?
No.
So if truth is anti-Semitic, what do we do?
Well, I think that,
The new anti-Semitism is what the BDS is about, isn't it?
yes, I mean,
What is our new narrative? What is Palestinian narrative, or our narrative for human justice?
I think it's to explain very clearly what the goals are, to, you know, look at the
No,
Palestinian...
we have Goldstone.
How do I ask a question?
Yeah,
Just walk towards it? Just walk towards it. Okay. Perhaps I should walk around.
Here's the difference.
It means a period to promote more economical warfare.
Here's the difference, though. Israel has relied on those traditional defenses. Military, which now is not, you know, they themselves have recognized a famous report that came out about a year ago from the Reut Institute that said the main threat to Israel is what they call delegitimization, a loss of standing in the eyes of the world, and not military. And we have, you know, invested all of our efforts into building up military defenses. Well, military defenses do you no good against the movement for freedom and liberation. Look at Libya. Look at the world reaction to Colonel Gaddafi using tanks and artillery and anti-aircraft guns against people struggling for freedom. What's Israel going to do if 1 million Palestinians start marching? Well, we've seen in the past it will kill them. But how many can it kill before the noose really starts to tighten? And we see the noose tightening. Now, we haven't seen, you know, many Western politicians standing up courageously and say the Goldstone report must be implemented and those allegations must be investigated, those responsible brought to trial. But we have seen the judicial system starting to unfreeze. So last year, for example, for the first time ever, a magistrate's court in the UK issued an arrest warrant for Tzipi Livni.
It was shut down.
It was shut down, yes. What happened? Well, the magistrate withdrew it because it turned out she wasn't in the country.
But if there's really lobbyist pressure, it's all over the whole world.
No, let's be very clear. Let's not disempower ourselves by saying the Israel lobby is all powerful. It's powerful, but it's not all powerful. Okay? So a magistrate issued an arrest warrant. Tzipi Livni wasn't arrested. But now Tzipi Livni has to think every time she gets on an airplane. She recently canceled a trip to South Africa because of the risk of arrest. You have several other examples in the past year of top Israeli officials, including a deputy prime minister and several generals, who have canceled trips to Europe, Spain, the Netherlands, other countries, the UK, because of fear of arrest. Because those governments could not guarantee that independent judiciaries would not implement the law and arrest him. What has the response from the UK government and other governments been? The UK government, their response was to promise first the Labour government and now the Conservative government, we will change the law to take away the independence of the judiciary in this area in order to stack the system in favor of Israeli war criminals. Right? But now, if they want to change the law in that way, they're going to have a fight on their hands. There's a movement that is going to stand up to that. And it's not a foregone conclusion that they can win. So this is the battle that we have to be prepared to fight. And not disempower ourselves by saying, well, they can't do anything. After Lebanon 2006, the news started to tighten. After Gaza, it started to tighten more. After the Mavi Marmara, the massacre on the high seas of a ship that was actually sailing away from the coast of Gaza at the time it was attacked, the noose is tightening. And, you know, Western politicians could say, oh, well, you know, go easy on them because there's a peace process. Now there's no peace process. The fig leaf is gone. So they are vulnerable. They are vulnerable to a movement that is calling for equal rights, international law, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. They're vulnerable to that. The way apartheid South Africa was, and this thing about delegitimization is very important. They're right, in a sense, because if you think about it, take the United States. You had, in the 1950s into the 1960s, the Jim Crow South, where you had legal, organized segregation, apartheid. White supremacy was the law of the land. And it was respectable. You know, governors and police chiefs and fire chiefs were members of the Ku Klux Klan in their millions. And they were the most respected citizens of their communities. All of that went away. Doesn't mean racism went away. Doesn't mean white supremacy went away. But the system and its legitimacy went away, and it can never be restored. So the fear that Israelis have is that the world wakes up to what's going on, and it loses legitimacy in the eyes of the world, and that can never be restored. And a system that is based on racial, ethnic, religious discrimination has no legitimacy. It's not something, you know, this is good for Israelis too. They may not see it now, but it's good for them. Yes, sir. Thank you.
Under the law of return, the Lebanese and the Falashis, many in the Philippines or the Asia are allowed to be citizens of Israel. Under the one standard, though, they are required to be in the army. For the next 10 years, how do you find their lives to be within the conflict?
You're referring to the Ethiopian Falasha and other communities that have been brought to Israel under the law of return. This has been quite controversial in Israel because the imperative of the Israeli state is to fight a demographic war with the Palestinians. They need numbers. The Jewish birth rate is much lower than the Palestinian birth rate. So there was one imperative, which is to bring Jews from wherever they could get them. And so they brought the Falasha in the 1980s. They brought, you know, a few Jews from India. They went and found a tribe in the Andes in Peru and did a quick conversion and brought them to settlements in the West Bank. This I write about it all in the book. And but on the other hand, you know, these were in Israeli Zionist terms low-quality Jews, in the sense that you want them to make up the numbers, but they're not the Jews you would choose if you had the choice. What you really want is those nice, wealthy Western Jews from Canada and North America who incidentally don't want to come to Israel. You know, they support Israel from a distance, many, but they won't move there. They move in very tiny numbers. So what's happened is that Israel is a very racially stratified society, even among Jews, and black Ethiopian Jews have suffered, as previously Arab Jews did who came to Israel from Iraq and Morocco and other countries. They've been on the bottom rung of Jewish community, Jewish society. There's a very high suicide rate, for example. It's one indicator among Ethiopian soldiers in the Israeli army. And you know, there's been all sorts of social and legal discrimination. Many school districts in Israel, for example, Petah Tikva, prevented the enrollment of black students. You also see this huge wave of anti-migrant, anti-refugee feeling in Israel, where the Mubarak regime actually had an agreement to shoot dead refugees coming from Africa through Israel to seek asylum, many coming from war zones, from Darfur, from other places, and something like 24 migrants were shot dead trying to cross into Israel in 2010 alone. So I think that an end to the Zionist apartheid system hopefully offers liberation to all the people in the country, including all those who've come. I mean, I think that the examples we have to learn from and improve on are other settler colonial societies where those however you've got there, your status is transformed from settler or native into citizen. And that means more than just saying everybody is equal. You have to say everyone is equal, but you also have to have restitution and redress. You can't just say, as we did in the United States after the civil rights era, everyone is equal, but oh, by the way, we're not going to do anything to redress the economic and social devastation of 200, 300 years of slavery. There's still been no reparations in the United States, not even organized investment to redress that imbalance. So those are some of the lessons we have to learn, and I think that Ethiopians and others who have come under the false promises of Zionism should be beneficiaries of that as well.
Thank you very much for coming. I'm just wondering, the Palestinian national movement seems a bit of a mess. And I was just wondering whether you could kind of maybe perhaps comment on that.
I can, absolutely. In fact, I can refer you to, because just to keep the answer brief, I wrote an article just a week or so ago on Al Jazeera, English, on the website called Toward Palestine's Mubarak Moment. And in that I looked at the sort of disastrous state of the Palestinian national movement. It reflects the Palestinian people who are divided and separated from each other, often physically, prevented from connecting with each other. I think that the BDS movement, it's not the be-all and end-all, it's not the solution to every problem, but I think it unites Palestinians, it has the potential to unite Palestinians and their allies over a straightforward, simple program that addresses the rights of all Palestinians, those in the diaspora who have been left out of the so-called peace process, the refugees, those in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, and those within Israel. That's what the Palestinian call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions sets out. It calls for restoration of the rights of those three groups. It doesn't take a position on one state or two states. In theory, it could be two states, but both states would have to be states which offer absolute equality to all their citizens. So that's one thing. The other thing is I think, and I had been arguing this before, that I think to a certain extent we shouldn't worry about the Palestinian experience of having sort of a centralized, bureaucratic, and yet transnational leadership has been very difficult, frankly, over the past few decades. The PLO went from being a liberation satisfactory answer, but it's one that, to me, is an intriguing possibility. Don't put all the energy into trying to have a big transnational bureaucracy that can again be corrupted and co-opted. Focus on the work of building the struggle, of educating people about the cause, and see where things go. And
not to attend, and saying it was anti-Semitic and that it was divisive and it was against peace and against freedom of speech. And my question was, if that's against freedom of speech, condemning it and asking people not to come and support, what is that? So I'm glad that you're here, because truth is truth. And I'd like everybody to remember that today is International Women's Day. And I'd like to take a few minutes of silence for the between 800 and 3,000 murdered and missing Indigenous women in Canada, and also for our Palestinian sisters who are going through equally as much hardship as we are as Indigenous women in this country. So I'd like everybody to stand for a minute or two to remember our fallen sisters.
To the lesser known town of Regina, Saskatchewan, I would be quaking in my boots and take that as a sign that Zionism and Israeli apartheid's days are numbered.
And Stephen Harper, too.
And Stephen Harper, absolutely. So I hope that this is the first of many Israeli apartheid weeks to come in Israel, but not, or sorry, in Regina, but not too many, because I think that if there's one thing that's been made resoundingly clear from the events in the Arab world over the last few months, it's that what was previously unthinkable is very much possible, and I don't think there's any reason to believe that if we do our part here as international solidarity activists alongside and in support of the liberation movement in Palestine, there's no reason to believe that we can't see the situation on the ground in Palestine be transformed fundamentally in much the same way as we've seen in the streets of Cairo and Tunis and elsewhere over the past few weeks and months. And I'm delighted to have Ali Abunimah here tonight as our keynote speaker. He's joining us from Chicago, where he's a writer and frequent commentator on Middle East and Arab affairs, as well as a full-time researcher in social policy at the University of Chicago. His writings have appeared in the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, the Chicago Tribune, the Financial Times, Lebanon's Daily Star, Haaretz, and elsewhere. He's the author of One Country, a bold proposal to end the Israel-Palestine impasse, which we have for sale here tonight. I encourage you to check out. And he's also one of the co-founders of the Electronic Intifada, which began in 2001 and has been one of the leading sources of independent reporting, analysis, and commentary on Israel and Palestine, and I think a much needed resource amid a sea of disinformation. Ali Abunimah has been a leading voice for Palestinian justice and human rights for many years, and it's my honor to welcome him here tonight.
Good evening.
Given that this conflict has for so long, like the terms of the discourse have for so long been dictated entirely by Israel and its supporters. And I think for the first time now, we're seeing that, this conflict is actually, it's not a conflict, it's an occupation, it's colonization, it's apartheid, and it's resistance to all of those forces. And the solution to this conflict is not about a Palestinian state in a series of discontiguous and isolated ghettos that are surrounded by concrete walls and razor wire. It's about the right of return of more than 5 million Palestinian refugees who've been in refugee camps for more than 6 decades now and are scattered around the world, including here in this room tonight. And it's about an end to the occupation and colonization of all Arab lands, not just the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And it's about full and equal rights to all Palestinian citizens of Israel who live under systematic racism and oppression as a result of their nationality and race and ethnicity. And these are the core demands of the Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions campaign, which began in 2005 and has been an inspiration to Israeli Apartheid Week and also played a central role in the international solidarity movement for the past 5 years and has made 6 years now and has made, I think, really tremendous strides in that time. And I think that now for the first time we're really seeing Israel and its supporters on the defensive as they're continuing to lose ground in this public relations war and resorting to, I think, increasingly desperate and repressive tactics such as canceling room bookings for events such as this one at the last minute on public institutions and universities, banning posters, public smear campaigns, banning even the term Israeli apartheid itself. And I think that, of course, most recently, Michael Ignatio's comments, but I think really we should be heartened by these developments and take it as a sign that this movement is really gaining momentum and it's not going anywhere, and it's increasingly a force to be reckoned with across North America and internationally. And I think if I were Avigdor Lieberman, Israel's foreign minister, and heard that Israeli Apartheid Week could now extend.
Thank you. And before we begin with our speaker, I think it's important that we understand the connections between what's happening in Palestine and what's happening here and what has happened here. I was recently watching a video that you can't find on YouTube. It was taken down very quickly by an ex-Israeli soldier talking about what happened there. And at the end he said, I owe a debt. I owe a debt to the Palestinians for everything that I have here. My home, the land that I live on, all the resources that I enjoy, and I need to repay that debt. And it really hit me. Because all of you are on Treaty 4 territory, and you owe a debt to those in Treaty 4. And debt does not mean guilt. Please do not own guilt. Anybody's guilt does me no good, and it does them no good. If you're part of the solution, which you are because you're here, then don't own that guilt. If you're going to go out there and be a racist, please feel guilty, but they don't. But yes, you owe a debt, just like the Israelis owe a debt, and we must always be cognizant of that. And in owing that debt, the best way to pay it back is to stand up and to right those wrongs and to spread the word. And that's what we need to do, because it's the same colonizers and it's the same mentality. After all, apartheid came from Canada. It started out here with all the policies on my peoples, and it went to Africa. It went apparently from Israel to Palestine, and wherever apartheid is, it's a little known fact, but it came from Canada and its policies on Indigenous peoples and on First Nations. And so we have to remember that, and if we're going to stand up against it, then we need to stand up against it at home and abroad, because apartheid still exists here in Canada. The UN rapporteur comes through Canada every now and then and listens and says, oh, there's apartheid in Canada, and wraps Canada's knuckles and goes home, and not much changes. So all of us together, standing as true sisters and brothers, no matter what color we are, no matter what walk of life we are, we can and will make a difference. Last night Angela Davis talked, and she talked about global mobilizations, and that's what we need to do. That's where our strength is, and that's where we know we can do something. And I don't want to take much more time, so I'm really happy you're here, and I'm going to have Valerie introduce our most honored speaker that we are so fortunate to have here tonight. And thank you once more for being here, and remember, resist.
Before I introduce Ali Abunimah, I just want to say a few words about Israeli Apartheid Week. This is the first Israeli Apartheid Week here in Regina. It's an international series of events that began 7 years ago as a project of a handful of activists with the Arab Student Collective in Toronto, and since then has expanded to more than 70 cities across the globe, from Jerusalem to Johannesburg, Dublin, London, New York, Mexico City, and also Sudbury, Ontario, Hamilton, Winnipeg, Calgary, Alberta, if you can believe it, and now here in Regina on Treaty 4 territory. So we're really excited to have everyone here tonight. Israeli Apartheid Week has played a really central role in reclaiming the terms and the language with which we discuss Israel-Palestine.